Even before the first shot echoed across the white plain, before the distant rumble of engines or the dry crackle of artillery, the true enemy was already there, silent, invisible, merciless. The Soviet winter. It wasn't just cold, it was something that seemed to have a will of its own. Temperatures plummeting to 30 degrees, 35 degrees, sometimes even less. The air burned my lungs as if each breath were made of ground glass. Inhaling hurt. Exhaling formed thick clouds that froze on the scarf, turning the fabric into a rigid sheet of ice. The wind didn't just blow, it cut. It slid across the open plains and pierced uniforms that hadn't been made for it. The soaked wool froze on the soldiers' bodies, boots hardened like stone, fingers lost feeling in minutes. First came the tingling, then the numbness, finally the total absence of sensation, and that's where the real danger began. The snow fell slowly, but relentlessly. Layers upon layers covered roads, fields, trails. Trucks got stuck. Horses slipped and broke their legs, being slaughtered right there, their bodies quickly covered by a white blanket. In a few minutes, what was life became just a shapeless mass under the snow. Roads vanished. Bridges became invisible beneath treacherous ice. Frozen rivers seemed solid until the moment they gave way under the weight of men and vehicles, swallowing them in black waters that killed in seconds. The soldiers felt the cold advance like a patient predator, first on their feet, then on their hands. The rifle trigger clung to their exposed skin. Metal and flesh became one. There were men tearing off chunks of skin, trying to free their fingers from frozen weapons. At night, the terror intensified. The sky cleared and became starry, beautiful, almost serene, but the temperature plummeted even further. Some men awoke to find their companion beside them, already stiff, eyes open, covered in ice crystals. There were no screams, there was no struggle, only the absolute silence of frozen death. Fires were difficult to maintain. The smoke gave away positions. The firewood was damp or buried under deep snow. Many slept sitting up, hugging their own bodies, trying to preserve some warmth. Some never woke up. And the cruelest thing of all? The cold made no distinction. Rank, courage, or experience didn't matter. It didn't hate, it didn't shout, it didn't advance with flags. It simply waited. I was hoping someone would stop for too long. I was hoping someone would move away from the column. I expected that an injured person would be unable to get up. Winter didn't need bullets. It killed slowly, without haste, without witnesses. And before any army actually clashed, before the first line was broken, hundreds had already fallen. Not from explosions, not from machine guns, but by the invisible icy touch of the Russian earth itself. The cold wasn't part of the setting, it was a sentence. When winter had already shown its teeth, came the blow that broke the backbone of the German front, Battle of Stalingrad. For months, the city on the banks of the Volga had been transformed into smoldering ruins. Buildings became concrete skeletons. Destroyed factories turned into makeshift fortresses. Every room, every staircase, every basement was contested with grenades, bayonets, and point-blank gunfire. It was a fight so close that soldiers said they could feel the enemy's breath before pulling the trigger. But in November 1942, everything changed. The Red Army launched Operation Uranus. It didn't attack the center, it attacked the flanks, protected by Romanian and Italian troops ill-equipped to withstand the winter and Soviet armor. And then came the encirclement. Swift, brutal, inevitable. The German Sixth Army, commanded by Friedrich Paulus, was trapped inside the devastated city. More than 250,000 men surrounded, without enough fuel, without enough food, without a proper winter, and with the cold biting like a walrus. Hitler promised supplies by air, but the planes couldn't deliver even half of what was needed. Soldiers began sharing meager rations. Horses were slaughtered for food. Then came the dogs, then anything that could be chewed. The cold caused weapons to malfunction. The oil froze. Wounded men piled up in makeshift shelters, many without anesthesia, many without hope. Gangrene spread. Limbs were amputated with blunt saws. Blood flowed and froze almost on contact with the ground. Outside, the Soviets were tightening the noose day by day. When the surrender finally came in February 1943, the world watched in astonishment. An entire army had been annihilated. Around 90,000 men were captured. Only a fraction would return home years later. But the impact wasn't just numerical. Stalingrad shattered something invisible, the aura of German invincibility. For the first time, the advance seemed not only stagnant, but reversed. The giant that had been marching since 1941 was now staggering, and the worst was yet to come. The destruction of the Sixth Army opened a huge gap in the southern front. Lines were left exposed. Neighboring divisions began to retreat to avoid the same fate. What had been an offensive became a desperate retreat. Columns began to move westward. Overcrowded trucks. Artillery abandoned due to lack of fuel. Wounded soldiers transported in makeshift carts. But winter was still there. And now he had thousands of exhausted, hungry and demoralized men marching directly into his deadly embrace. The collapse wasn't just military. It was psychological. It was human. And as the Red Army advanced like a relentless tide, a new phase of the war began. Not one of conquest, but of survival, the withdrawal. As the columns began to crumble in the ice and the echo of the Stalingrad catastrophe still reverberated across the Eastern Front, an order rang out from afar, firm, rigid, almost unreal in the face of the situation on the ground. No steps backward! Coming from the German High Command, directly from the leadership of Adolf Hitler, the determination was clear. Positions had to be held at all costs. Every village, every railway line, every rise in the terrain had to be defended to the last man. On paper, it seemed like a show of firmness. In reality, it was a death sentence. The officers in the field saw something very different from the maps spread out on heated tables in distant barracks. They saw men freezing in the trenches, vehicles without fuel, units reduced to half their strength, communications failing in the extreme cold. They knew the line was breaking. The Red Army advanced with renewed confidence. T-34 tanks appeared on the horizon like dark silhouettes against the endless white. Soviet artillery bombarded German positions relentlessly. Each day, the deep sound of the cannons grew closer, but the order was to resist. In many sectors, entire companies were left isolated, without reinforcements, without supplies, without a real chance of organized withdrawal. The idea was to transform each position into a fortress. In practice, they became frozen traps. Imagine men digging trenches in ground that felt like concrete. Pickaxes struck the frozen ground, sending sparks flying. Their hands, even inside gloves, cracked and bled. Some soldiers urinated on their own hands to try and warm them for a few seconds, and yet they had to stay. There was also fear, not only of the enemy ahead, but of the consequences of disobedience. Officers who ordered a retreat without authorization could face court-martial. The weight of responsibility was overwhelming. In some sectors, local commanders ignored orders and quietly retreated to save what remained of their units. In others, they obeyed and were swallowed up. When the Soviet attack finally fell upon these fixed positions, it was devastating. Tanks crushed trenches. Infantry advanced amidst explosions. Machine guns swept across frozen fields where soldiers tried to run with legs already numb from the cold. And then came the silence. Some positions simply disappeared from the reports. No response by radio, no known survivors, only coordinates scratched on the map. The order not to retreat transformed the necessary retreat into an even bloodier collapse. Instead of flexible lines, there were violent ruptures. Instead of reorganization, there was belated panic. And when permission to withdraw finally came, too late in many sectors, it was no longer a matter of strategic maneuvering. It was an escape. Winter continued there, indifferent. The enemy was advancing, and thousands of men, caught between order and reality, realized they were fighting not only against the Red Army, but against decisions that kept them idle while death approached. When it finally became clear that holding those positions meant total annihilation, the order to retreat came, but it came too late. Too late for many. What could have been an organized withdrawal turned into a desperate escape through a white hell. There was no time for proper planning. There was no time to reorganize lines or prepare safe routes. The front simply gave way. Columns began to form on the few roads still recognizable beneath the snow. Overloaded trucks, some with engines failing due to the extreme cold. Artillery pieces being slowly towed by exhausted horses. Soldiers walking alongside the vehicles to conserve fuel. The metallic clang of chains on the wheels echoed across the frozen plain. The problem was simple and brutal. There were more men than transport. Officers shouted orders, trying to impose some order on the chaos. Units mixed together. Entire regiments lost contact with their commanders. Hierarchy began to dissolve under the constant pressure of the Soviet advance. And then the first signs of total collapse began to appear. Vehicles got stuck in the deep snow. When a truck broke down, it blocked the entire convoy behind it. There weren't enough winches. Often they simply pushed the vehicle off the road or abandoned it right there with ammunition and supplies inside. Horses collapsed, exhausted. Some slipped on the ice and broke their legs. The dry sound of the gunshot that felled them became commonplace. Their bodies lay behind, freezing quickly, eyes open to a grey and indifferent sky. Men marched for hours, then days. Their soaked boots froze on their feet. Some improvised coverings with pieces of blankets or even paper torn from old maps. Every step was painful. Every prolonged stop was risky. The cold was relentless. To stop meant to get cold. To get cold meant to die. The Red Army gave no respite. Soviet reconnaissance patrols constantly pressed the rear. Long-range artillery rained down on strategic crossroads. Planes appeared whenever the weather permitted, strafing exposed columns as easy targets on the white snow. And in the midst of this chaos were the wounded. Some were placed in the back of trucks, stacked on top of ammunition boxes. Others were transported in makeshift carts. But it quickly became apparent that there wasn't room for them all. The forced retreat revealed the cruelest truth of war. When resources are limited and the enemy advances, choices must be made, and those choices would leave scars that would never disappear. The road westward was not merely a route of retreat, it was a corridor of despair, a river of exhausted men flowing beneath a sky of steel. Winter was watching, the enemy was approaching, and the march had only just begun. At first, nobody wanted to admit it. Everyone believed that somehow there would be room, that there would be time, that an extra truck would show up at the last minute. But the reality was cold as winter itself. The makeshift medical posts were overcrowded. Barns transformed into infirmaries, damp cellars serving as operating rooms. The floor covered in straw soaked with blood that froze into dark patches. The smell was a suffocating mixture of iron, sweat, gunpowder, and decaying flesh. Doctors worked tirelessly. Hands trembled, not just from exhaustion but from the cold. Surgical instruments froze, blades stuck to the skin. Many amputations were performed without sufficient anesthesia. The men's cries echoed low, muffled by clenched teeth and the fear of attracting enemy attention. The most serious cases were the worst. Abdominal wounds, punctured lungs, legs torn apart by artillery shrapnel, some still conscious, begging not to be left behind, others silent, staring at the wooden ceiling as if they already understood what was to come. When the officers began to organize the retreat, the math became brutal. There were few vehicles, little fuel, little time. The trucks were prioritized for ammunition, radios, maps, and essential officers. Then came the wounded who still had a chance of surviving with proper treatment. The rest were left behind. It wasn't said aloud, but everyone knew. Some soldiers carried their comrades on their backs until they could no longer feel their own legs. Others improvised sleds with doors torn from abandoned houses. But the deep snow slowed everything down, and slowness meant death for everyone. The moment of decision had arrived. A friend holding another's hand, promising to return. "Wait, we'll come back for you." Lies told with sincerity, because at that moment, whoever was promising something truly wanted to believe it. Some of the wounded asked to be left with a gun with a single bullet. Others asked only for water. Some wept softly. Others maintained a silent dignity that was all the more painful to witness. There were also those who could not be moved. Soldiers with frozen legs, already black with gangrene. Men delirious with fever. Bodies so debilitated that any transport would kill them on the way. And then the columns began to move. Heavy footsteps in the snow, the distant sound of sputtering engines. No one looked back for long, because looking meant breaking inside. As the last truck departed, and silence returned, only the wind and faint groans remained. Some of those abandoned would die that very night, the cold slowly seeping into their bodies like a deadly anesthetic. Others would survive for hours, perhaps days, until Soviet patrols found them. The worst part wasn't just the physical abandonment, it was the psychological burden that accompanied those who left. Because in war, killing the enemy is expected, but to leave a friend to die in the snow, this is something that never leaves a man. And winter, impassive, covered everything with its white cloak, as if trying to hide what had happened. The evacuation progressed slowly, but decisions had to be made in seconds, and none was more cruel than this. Save a friend or save yourself. Imagine a scene, snow up to our knees, the sky heavy and grey. In the distance, the muffled sound of Soviet artillery, and in the middle of the road, a wounded soldier trying to stand with a shattered leg, the blood already darkening on his frozen uniform. He's looking at you, not as one soldier looks at another, but as one human being looks at someone who may be their last hope. Don't leave me. Those 3 words echoed thousands of times that winter. Some tried to carry their companion on their shoulders. They walked a few meters, then 10, then 20. Their legs began to fail. Their breath turned to thick vapor in the frozen air. Each step seemed to pull their bodies into the snow. The problem wasn't just the weight, it was the time. Falling behind meant being caught, and being caught could mean immediate death or capture. There were men who refused to abandon their friends. They stayed, they waited together. Sometimes they died together. The cold made no distinction between loyalty and recklessness. Others tried to improvise solutions. Doors ripped from houses served as sleds. Belts were tied to pull bodies through the snow. But the friction was great. The terrain was uneven. The wind was strong. It soon became clear that the column was moving away. And then came the moment that would mark a lifetime. The hand that lets go, not for lack of love, not out of cowardice, but because if he stayed one more minute, 2 would die instead of 1. Some soldiers left their canteens beside their comrades. Others shared their last ration. Many promised to return when the line was reorganized. Most people knew it was a lie. There were also even harsher decisions. Wounded soldiers who asked to be left alone, who pleaded with their companions to continue. Some even ordered, as if they were still in charge of something, that they be left there. And when the column finally moved on, the silence that remained was unbearable. The wind rustled through the bare trees. The snow continued to fall, slowly covering the still-breathing body. First the face, then the shoulders, as if the earth itself were reclaiming that man. For those who were leaving, each step forward was heavier than the last. Because the real weight wasn't in the backpacks nor in the weapons, it was in my conscience. Decades later, survivors would still talk about that specific moment, not the explosions, not the gunshots, but the exact instant when they had to choose. In war, there are battles against armies, but there are also battles within one's own heart. And that winter, many lost both. as the exhausted and battered German columns struggled to drag their feet through the deep snow that piled up like a relentless blanket of white. Death, the distant horizon began to morph into an omen of inevitable doom. The air, already sharp as ice blades, carried with it the first whispers of an impending catastrophe. First, there was a distant sound, a low, ominous rumble echoing across the frozen plains, like the roar of an ancient beast awakening from a deep sleep. An almost imperceptible tremor beneath their feet, as if the earth itself were writhing in agony, vibrating with the approach of something colossal and inexorable. Then, the unmistakable roar of powerful engines tearing through the frozen air, a mechanical chorus of fury growing in intensity, filling the void with a symphony of impending destruction. The Red Army was advancing. It was no mere tactical move, but a red avalanche of vengeance, fueled by the fire of retaliation after years of brutal invasion and unspeakable suffering. Following the decisive victory at the Battle of Stalingrad, where Soviet forces, led by generals such as Vasily Chuikov and Georgy Zhukov, had encircled and annihilated the German Sixth Army under Friedrich Paulus, capturing over 91,000 prisoners in February 1943, the strategic initiative had irreversibly shifted. Stalingrad had not been just a battle. It had been the turning point of the war in the East, where the myth of Nazi invincibility shattered like glass under the weight of Soviet tanks and the resilience of a people who had lost millions to famine, bombardment, and occupation. Now, it was the Soviets who were pressing, encircling, pushing the enemy westward without granting a single moment's respite, transforming the German retreat into a desperate escape through a frozen hell. They advanced with a fierce determination, a primal fury forged in the ashes of devastated cities like Leningrad, where the Nazi siege had killed more than 1 million civilians from hunger and cold between 1941 and 1944, or Kiev, where massacres like Babi Yar claimed tens of thousands in mass graves. This collective memory of horror fueled every step, every shot, transforming ordinary soldiers into instruments of bloody justice. T-34 tanks emerged like dark shadows in the white storm, their hulls painted in winter camouflage, rising from the mists like vengeful ghosts. Designed by engineers like Mikhail Koshkin, these armored vehicles were masterpieces of Soviet engineering. Diesel engines that roared tirelessly in the extreme cold, withstanding temperatures that paralyzed the delicate mechanics of German panzer. Tanks, wide tracks with claws that bit into the deep snow like the fangs of a predator, cut through the terrain with brutal efficiency, allowing speeds that the Nazi vehicles, bogged down in frozen mud, could only dream of. Where German trucks, overloaded with meager supplies and groaning wounded, sank up to their axles in snowdrifts that reached meters high, Soviet armored vehicles swept through like an inexorable tide, crushing obstacles under their 26-ton weight. The infantry followed, behind, wearing white camouflage uniforms that blended them into the snowy landscape, making them almost invisible, like wandering specters in a world of endless white. These soldiers, many of them recruits from Siberian farms accustomed to the harsh Russian winter, moved silently with calculated steps that barely disturbed the crust of ice. Difficult to detect against the snowy backdrop, they infiltrated like fog, approaching German positions without fanfare. Many German soldiers, exhausted and with their senses dulled by the cold, only realized they were under attack when the first shots echoed a few meters away, cracking like whips in the icy air. Shouts of panic then erupted, mingling with the crackling of Mosin Nagant rifles and PPSH-41 submachine guns, weapons that spat fire in furious bursts, reaping lives in an instant. Terror set in. Imagine the horror of a German Lanzer, trembling in an improvised trench, hearing only the howling wind, only to be suddenly confronted by ghostly figures emerging from the snow, cold and resolute eyes behind ice masks, firing without mercy. Soviet artillery worked tirelessly, a constant hammering that echoed like the final judgment. Cannons like the 152mm howitzers and katyushas, the famous Stalin's organs, fired coordinated salvos against known retreat routes, transforming vital routes into corridors of annihilation. Crossroads became deadly traps, where projectiles rained down like explosive hail, shattering vehicles and men into unrecognizable fragments. Bridges, already weakened by accumulated ice, were bombarded until they gave way under the weight of the explosive fire, collapsing into frozen rivers with a roar that echoed for miles, swallowing entire columns in black, icy waters. Every route that seemed safe became a corridor of death, where the air filled with flying debris, frozen earth, and the cries of the dying. The Soviets, learning from their own initial losses in Operation Barbarossa in 1941, when millions were captured or killed in sieges like that of Smolensk, now applied siege tactics with surgical precision, using artillery to pin the enemy in place while flanks were encircled. And then there were the air raids, which transformed the sky into an abyss of terror when the grey clouds parted for a few precious hours. Soviet planes like the Ilyushin Il-2 Sturmovik, nicknamed flying tanks for their heavy armor, dove upon the exposed columns with predatory fury. 23mm machine guns swept through trucks crammed with exhausted men, tearing through metal and flesh in equal measure, while bombs exploded in the snow, raising white clouds mixed with dark earth, scarlet blood, and bone fragments. Bodies were hurled against frozen trees, breaking branches with dull impacts, leaving trails of frozen horror. These attacks were not random. They were coordinated with intelligence from local partisans, guerrillas operating behind German lines, sabotaging supplies and providing precise coordinates. Desperation was growing. German soldiers, already starving and freezing, looked to the sky in terror, knowing that every clearing could bring winged death, turning an already torturous march into an aerial hunt. For the retreating Germans, the Soviet advance was not merely military, it was psychological, a slow and inexorable erosion of sanity, instilling a primal fear of being hunted like prey in an endless forest. The feeling was of being pursued by an omnipresent entity, invisible, until the fatal moment. Soviet reconnaissance patrols, composed of agile skiers equipped with wooden skis that glided silently over the snow, infiltrated ice-covered forests where tall pines bent under the weight of winter, creating dark labyrinths. They cut through minor routes, ambushing isolated convoys with grenades and mines, attacking weakened rearguards that could barely mount a defense. Small, isolated groups were quickly surrounded, forced to surrender or die in desperate firefights, where blood smoldered in the cold air before freezing into red puddles. The terror amplified at night, when darkness swallowed everything, and whispers of movement in the snow suggested the proximity of unseen enemies. Many of the wounded left behind, abandoned by columns unable to bear the extra weight, began to hear footsteps in the snow, a soft crackling that grew louder, heralding the end. Some were found still alive, trembling uncontrollably, delirious with visions of home, begging for mercy. In hoarse voices, others were already rigid, eyes fixed on the grey sky, mouths open in silent screams, covered by a thin layer of frost that turned them into statues of despair. But there was no time for compassion on a front where the war in the east was relentless, a mutual carnage that had claimed tens of millions since the German invasion in June 1941. Soviet losses had also been immense. In the Battle of Kursk in July 1943, the largest tank battle in history, with over 6,000 armored vehicles involved, the Soviets lost hundreds of thousands but emerged victorious, driven by industrial production, churning out tanks and weapons in factories relocated to the Urals. The desire for revenge burned brightly after months of invasion and destruction, with entire villages burned, women and children massacred in Nazi retaliatory actions such as those at Katyn in 1943, where 149 civilians were burned alive. Thus, the advance did not slow down. It was a red wave sweeping across the continent, reclaiming lost territories with a speed that terrified German commanders like Erich von Manstein, whose attempts at counterattacks, such as the Third Battle of Kharkov, only delayed the inevitable. With each kilometer gained, the space for German reorganization shrank like a noose tightening around their necks. The retreat became even more chaotic, with entire divisions, like the 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandart, finding themselves threatened with encirclement in pockets like Korsun-Cherkasy in February 1944, where 60,000 Germans were surrounded and decimated, with only a fraction escaping through icy rivers under constant fire. And as the sound of tanks drew closer, a roar that vibrated in their bones and echoed in tormented dreams, many retreating soldiers began to realize a terrible truth. They were not simply retreating. They were racing against time, against the cold that gnawed at their insides, against an enemy that now had the initiative and did not intend to waste it, driven by a thirst for revenge that transformed each advance into an act of collective atonement. Winter had begun its sentence, its icy claws tightening around the front. The Soviet advance was to execute it, with tanks and bayonets as merciless executioners, leaving behind a trail of frozen bodies and shattered hopes. If the Soviet advance was the hammer forged in the fury of war, crashing against the German lines, winter was the silent blade that finished the blow, cutting, slowly, inexorably through flesh and spirit. It was not a brute, visible force, but an insidious presence, an invisible killer that seeped like poison into the veins, transforming the body into its own tomb. The cold did not attack all at once, with the drama of an explosion or the chaos of a battle. It insinuated itself, subtle and patient, like a predator waiting for the perfect moment for the final strike, instilling a profound terror, a hopelessness that corroded the soul before reaping life. First came the uncontrollable trembling, a primal spasm of the body struggling to generate heat in a world where the thermometer plunged beyond 40 degrees Celsius, temperatures that had paralyzed entire armies throughout history, such as Napoleon's in 1812, during the retreat from Moscow, where hundreds of thousands perished in the Russian ice. Teeth chattered so forcefully that some soldiers cracked the enamel, producing a rhythmic and maddening sound that echoed through the endless nights, mingling with the groans of the wounded and the howling of the wind. Hands lost precision, fingers stiffened like dry branches, turning simple tasks, loading a Mauser rifle, lighting a meager cigarette, or even buttoning a coat, into Herculean battles. Pulling the trigger required conscious effort, a concentration that dissipated in the mental fog of exhaustion, leading to fatal errors in combat where seconds decided life or death. Then, numbness would set in, a treacherous numbness that masked the impending agony. Their feet would stop hurting, and that was the worst sign, a false relief signaling tissue death, the frostbite that had claimed countless soldiers in past winters, such as the Russo-Finnish War of 1939 to 1940, where General Winter helped the Finns inflict devastating losses on the Soviets. Many soldiers only realized they were freezing when, in rare moments of shelter, they removed their soaked boots and saw their pale toes, then bluish with cyanosis, then black with dry gangrene, a necrosis that smelled of rot even in the cold that preserved their bodies. The skin cracked like ancient parchment, bleeding drops that froze almost instantly into red crystals, creating wounds that never healed, becoming inflamed with infections that devoured what little strength remained. There were men who would wake up in the morning, if one could call the grey twilight that barely illuminated the horizon, morning, and be unable to stand, their legs simply unresponsive, paralyzed by hypothermia that had crept in during their restless sleep. Others had ears hardened like petrified wood, noses darkened by necrosis, faces swollen and deformed by the edema of the cold, transforming once youthful faces into grotesque masks of suffering. The terror deepened at the sight of mutilated comrades. Imagine the horror of seeing a comrade remove gloves to reveal black, lifeless hands, fingers that broke like twigs at the slightest touch, requiring improvised amputations with knives heated in the fire, without anesthesia, only screams echoing in the white vastness. But the cruelest stage was the mental one, where hypothermia brought confusion, delirium, a frozen madness that distorted reality into a living nightmare. A false sensation of warmth invaded the senses, a deadly trick of the body where victims began to remove coats in the middle of the raging snow, believing they were overheated in an imaginary hell, exposing themselves even more to the lethal embrace of winter. Others lay in the soft snow, murmuring that they only needed to rest for a minute that stretched into eternity, their glazed eyes fixed on the void while their hearts slowed to silence. Comrades tried to drag these men back to reality, shaking them with trembling hands, slapping frozen faces, shouting names that were lost in the wind, cutting like blades. But the voice came out weak, hoarse from the dry air that tore at their throats. And sometimes it was already too late, the body surrendering to final sleep, leaving behind an emptiness that echoed in the group, fueling the collective despair. Death by cold was silent, a terrifying contrast to the cacophony of war. There was no deafening explosion, no blood gushing in red arcs, only the body shrinking, slowing, until it stopped, like a clock whose spring has run out. During the endless march, it was common to see motionless silhouettes along the way, soldiers who had stopped the night before, abandoned by columns that could not wait. Some sat against ancient trees, arms crossed in a futile embrace against the cold, faces frozen in expressions of resignation. Others knelt as if praying to indifferent gods, knees sunk into the snow that gradually covered them, layer after layer, like a funeral shroud woven by the wind. There were also those who froze, while still too alive to die, but too weak to go on. Men with stiff hands unable to hold rationed food, bread as hard as a rock, cans of meat that froze before. They could be opened, faces swollen from the extreme cold, red, watery eyes that burned at the slightest breath of wind, blurred visions that turned shadows into phantom enemies. And all this was happening while they were still under constant threat of attack, a double torment that amplified the terror to unbearable levels. Imagine trying to maintain military discipline when your body is failing, betrayed by itself. Each step a battle against your own flesh, muscles burning with accumulated lactic acid, lungs burning as you inhale air that cut like ground glass. When the simple act of surviving the night, crouching in holes in the snow, sharing the meager warmth of huddled bodies, listening to the crackling of freezing limbs, was a Pyrrhic victory, a struggle that exhausted reserves of hope. The cold didn't shout orders like a furious Feldwebel, didn't fire shots like an invisible sniper, but it killed with ruthless efficiency, claiming more lives than bullets in many campaigns, such as the German retreat after the Battle of Moscow in 1941-1942, where the Russian winter decimated entire divisions, leaving 100,000 dead from the cold alone. Many surviving soldiers later said, in voices haunted by memories that never faded, that they feared the winter more than the Soviet enemy, more than the roaring tanks or the falling bombs, because against the enemy you could shoot, feel the recoil of the weapon in trembling hands, see the impact, and perhaps survive. You could run, heavy, legs sinking into the snow, heart pounding in your chest. You could hide in icy ravines or behind abandoned vehicles praying for a patrol to pass. Against the cold, you could only resist, a futile resistance against an elemental force that knew no mercy, that penetrated layers of wool and leather, that stole vital warmth drop by drop, until the spirit broke in utter despair. In that retreat, resistance was something that was rapidly dwindling, like dwindling supplies, like morale dissipating in the wind, leaving behind an army of staggering shadows, condemned to an eternal march of terror and loss, where each snowflake was a harbinger of inevitable death. At first, there was still some order, a tenuous vestige of the Prussian discipline that had propelled the German army across continents, conquering nations with the precision of a well-oiled machine. Officers at the front, mounted on exhausted horses or in vehicles that creaked under the weight of accumulated ice, dictated the pace, with hoarse voices, gesturing with maps stiffened by the cold. Sergeants shouted commands that echoed faintly in the icy air, ordering formations that had once been flawless, like the panzer divisions that devastated Poland in 1939 or France in 1940, in lightning campaigns that seemed invincible. Vehicles lined up in sequence, Opel Blitz trucks overloaded with dwindling supplies, Panzer IV tanks with tracks rusted by the salt snow, and carts pulled by hungry horses snaked along the muddy roads, trying to preserve an illusion of military cohesion. Units struggling to maintain formation, with platoons marching in lines that stretched for miles, faded Nazi flags weakly fluttering in the biting wind, like ghosts of a vanished glory. But as the days dragged on, stretching into an eternity of suffering, the cold bit mercilessly, penetrating layers of tattered uniforms, freezing sweat into crystals that scratched the skin like fine sand. The Soviet advance pressed ever closer, the distant roar of T-34 tanks echoing like an execution drum, inexorably approaching, forcing the retreat to accelerate at a pace that human bodies could barely endure. The structure began to crumble, not with a dramatic collapse, but with a slow and relentless erosion, like a sandcastle dissolving beneath persistent waves. The columns ceased to be cohesive military units, transforming into human masses struggling to survive. A jumble of staggering figures, united not by loyalty or duty, but by the primal instinct to flee. Divisions mingled in an indistinct chaos. Wehrmacht soldiers, once proud in their grey uniforms, now marched side by side with remnants of the SS. Foreign volunteers from units like the Spanish Blue Division or the Belgian Wallonia Legion, and even prisoners of war forced to serve, all equally reduced to hunched silhouettes against the white horizon. Insignia no longer meant much when everyone was equally covered in ice, frozen mud that clung like a second skin, and exhaustion that weighed on their shoulders like invisible chains, erasing hierarchies in an egalitarianism forced by misery. Trucks broke down and were abandoned by the roadside, engines failing from frozen fuel or axles snapping under the excessive weight, leaving behind metal carcasses that became grim landmarks in the snowy landscape. Some were set on fire to avoid falling intact into Soviet hands, orange flames erupting in the icy night, casting flickering shadows over men with sunken faces and deep-set eyes, briefly illuminating expressions of utter despair, as if the fire were a final rebellion against fate. The crackling of the flames mingled with the groans of the wounded abandoned inside, too weak to be rescued, their voices echoing like spectral laments that haunted the survivors in tormented dreams. Weapons began to be discarded, an act that once would have been considered treason, but now was mere survival. Heavy machine guns, like the MG-42s that spewed fire at 200 rounds per minute in past battles, were too heavy to carry for miles through the deep snow, abandoned beside roads where the snow quickly covered them, turning them into buried relics. Artillery pieces, Pak-40 cannons that had halted Soviet advances at Kursk, were left behind when the horses died, once robust animals now reduced to staggering skeletons, falling to their knees with weak neighs, eyes glazed into the void, forcing the men to choose between dragging the equipment or saving their own lives. Ammunition boxes were hastily opened, cartridges distributed into torn pockets, and the rest left behind, scattered in the snow like seeds of a cursed harvest. The priority was no longer fighting, defending positions, or counterattacking with the ferocity that characterized Operation Barbarossa. It was moving, advancing one step at a time in a seemingly endless march. Each meter gained a Pyrrhic victory against imminent collapse, and moving was becoming increasingly difficult, with the treacherous terrain betraying their feet. deep snow that swallowed boots up to their knees, slippery ice that caused brutal falls, breaking bones and spirits. Soldiers improvised foot protection with dirty rags, pieces of blankets stolen from abandoned villages, even paper torn from military maps that once guided conquests, now reduced to makeshift bandages. Many walked with bloodied feet inside their stiff ice boots, blisters bursting into open wounds that bled freely, each step leaving a dark mark in the snow, a trail of pain that snaked backward like a silent accusation. The stench of decay spread, gangrene taking hold in frozen limbs, forcing brutal amputations with knives heated over meager fires. Without anesthesia, only screams that cut through the night and echoed in the memories of those who watched, powerless. Some men simply left the main road and disappeared among the trees, dense pine forests that stretched like dark labyrinths, snow-heavy branches bending like menacing claws. Unable to continue, perhaps seeking shelter in abandoned huts or natural caves, perhaps just wanting to be alone for a few minutes to cry silently or pray to gods who seemed deaf. They rarely returned, swallowed by the endless white, their bodies discovered days later by Soviet patrols, frozen in fetal positions, as if the cold had lulled them into an eternal sleep. Discipline began to unravel not out of cowardice, but out of utter exhaustion, a fatigue that penetrated the bones, making every movement an agony. Officers shouted to maintain formation, voices weakened by the cold that tore at throats, threatening with Walter pistols that trembled in numb hands. Sometimes they were obeyed, with soldiers dragging themselves back to the line in a last burst of obedience. Other times, no. Empty stares ignoring commands, bodies simply falling in the snow without the strength for rebellion, just to keep putting one foot in front of the other, a mechanical ritual that was all that remained of their humanity. And then came the attacks, sudden and devastating, amplifying the chaos in a maelstrom of primal panic. When Soviet artillery struck a congested column, with volleys of Katyusha rockets howling like banshees in the sky, the chaos multiplied in an instant. Projectiles exploded in the snow, raising geysers of frozen earth and lethal fragments that tore through flesh and metal, turning men into unrecognizable masses. Men ran without a clear direction, stumbling over each other in a blind stampede, shouting the names of comrades lost in the tumult. Vehicles desperately tried to maneuver, wheels spinning in vain in the mud, ultimately blocking the passage even further, creating bottlenecks where panic intensified. Screams mingled with the muffled sound of explosions, drowned out by the snow, a chorus of agony that included the neighing of wounded horses, engines coughing in agony, and the laments of the wounded pleading for help that would never come. After each attack, the column grew smaller, an inexorable decrease that corroded the collective soul. Some dead instantly, shattered bodies scattered like debris, some wounded abandoned by the roadside, pleading eyes following their departing companions, voices fading into silence. Some simply vanished, swallowed by smoke and snow, perhaps captured, perhaps fleeing to a worse fate. At night, when they finally stopped for a few hours in clearings sheltered from the wind, the men sat silently around, feeble, fires fueled by damp wood that smoldered more than it burned. They spoke little, words freezing in their throats, replaced by dry coughs and exhausted sighs. Many simply stared blankly, glazed eyes reflecting the dancing flames, minds wandering to distant memories of warm homes, lost families, or the accumulated horror of battles like Smolensk or the siege of Leningrad, where suffering had become routine. The exhaustion was so profound that even fear seemed distant, a distant fog in numb minds, replaced by an apathy that was almost worse, a void where hope had been extinguished. The army that had crossed borders with confidence, marching to the sound of martial hymns and promises of Lebensraum, now dragged itself westward like a shadow of its former self, a procession of staggering specters, tattered uniforms hanging like shrouds, faces prematurely aged by terror and deprivation. The columns were not merely retreating, They were disintegrating, fragmenting into smaller and smaller groups, like an empire crumbling under its own weight, echoing historical retreats such as that of Charles the Fiend of Sweden at Poltava or Napoleon's Grande Armée, where the Russian winter had proven to be the greatest conqueror. Winter continued to fall in constant soft and relentless flakes, erasing traces of bloody footprints, covering corpses with a white blanket that rendered them invisible, hiding abandoned equipment under layers that transformed them into anonymous mounds, as if it wanted to erase the evidence of that desperate retreat, sweeping the horror beneath a carpet of pure snow, but leaving deep scars on the souls of those who continued. But for the men who still marched, nothing would be erased. Each kilometer traveled left an invisible scar, an indelible mark of loss, of abandoned comrades, of shattered dreams. And the road ahead was still far from over, stretching into a grey horizon of more suffering, more terror, where hopelessness became a constant companion, whispering promises of an end that always seemed postponed but inevitable. If the cold was constant, the attack came in bursts. There were moments of absolute silence, only the crunch of snow under tired boots, the distant sound of sputtering engines, the wind rustling through bare trees, and then, without warning, the sky roared. When the clouds parted for a few hours, Soviet planes would emerge, tearing through the icy air, tiny dark spots rapidly growing into machines, plunging toward the exposed columns. There was nowhere to run. In the deep snow, men couldn't get off the road quickly. Trucks got stuck trying to avoid them. Horses, already nervous and exhausted, panicked. The first plunge came with the shrill sound of machine guns. Bursts of gunfire cut through the column like a scythe. Soldiers threw themselves to the ground, trying to take cover behind frozen wheels or the wreckage of abandoned vehicles. The white snow exploded in small, dark jets when bullets hit the ground. Then came the bombs. The explosion in the snow produced a dull, muffled wave, but the impact was devastating. Shrapnel tore through flesh. Bodies were hurled into the air like mannequins. What seconds before had been an organized formation had become a sprawling field of wounded, screaming men. And when the planes took off, the silence returned. But it was a different kind of silence, heavy, filled with moans. The survivors slowly rose to their feet. Some were temporarily deafened by the explosion. Others were trying to staunch the blood that froze before it had fully drained. They barely had time to reorganize when another threat emerged. Ambushes. Soviet patrols advanced through the forests parallel to the main roads. They waited for the right moment. They chose narrow stretches, sharp bends, points where the column needed to reduce speed. The first shot was almost always accurate. A truck was hit. An officer was knocked down. A horse felled, blocking the road. And then came the coordinated burst of gunfire. German soldiers tried to fight back, but the cold slowed every movement. Stiff fingers struggled to find the trigger. Some rifles misfired due to freezing. Others simply couldn't be raised in time. The fight was short, brutal, close. Grenades exploded among ice-covered trees. Shrapnel ricocheted off frozen trunks. The smell of gunpowder mingled with the biting air. And again, after intense minutes, the Soviets disappeared into the forest. They left behind more dead, more wounded, more men who might not be able to continue. The retreat became a succession of blows. There was no real rest, not during the day, not at night. The soldiers began to live in a constant state of tension. Every sound in the woods could be the enemy. Every noise in the sky could mean attack. The mental exhaustion was just as devastating as the physical exhaustion, and yet they needed to continue. Because stopping meant being caught. Being caught meant being surrounded. And siege, at that stage of the war, meant something that everyone knew all too well. The road to retreat was not only long, it was a hunt. And the men who marched through it no longer knew whether they feared the sky, the forest, or the cold that never left them. As the days passed, the retreat acquired a whispered nickname among the men, unofficial, not written in reports, but repeated in hushed tones: the frozen road to death. It wasn't a single highway, it was dozens of snow-covered paths, rural trails, makeshift routes through open fields and dark forests, but they all had something in common: bodies. At first, the dead were few and still recognizable. A soldier fallen by the side of the road, another leaning against a tree, perhaps a horse frozen where it had fallen. But as the withdrawal progressed, the numbers grew. There were patches where the snow concealed shapes beneath the surface, small elevations that revealed what lay beneath. Sometimes a rigid arm remained visible. Sometimes a boot emerged from the ice like a silent landmark. Soldiers marched, looking straight ahead, trying not to see, but it was impossible to ignore. In some places, the men literally had to step over frozen bodies to continue, not out of cruelty, but because there was no space. The road was narrow, the snow deep, and the flow of people needed to keep going. The feeling under my boots was different, more solid than snow, heavier. Nobody commented. At night, when the convoy briefly paused, the cold did its final work. Wounded soldiers who had managed to keep up until then succumbed silently. Some were found in the morning with their eyes open, a thin layer of ice covering their eyelashes and eyebrows. There was no time for proper burials. Under normal circumstances, soldiers would bury their dead, mark makeshift crosses, and make a farewell gesture. But the ground was frozen as stone. Pickaxes couldn't penetrate more than a few centimeters. Thus, the snow became a cemetery. The wind blew, quickly obscuring any trace. Within hours, it seemed as if nothing had happened, as if nature were erasing the scene. But for those who marched, each kilometer carried memories. There were men who recognized friends they had left behind days before, now motionless, partially covered, their faces unrecognizable by the ice, their uniforms as stiff as wood. And yet, the column needed to continue. Some soldiers began to feel something dangerous: indifference, not because they were insensitive, but because the human mind has limits. When death becomes a constant part of the landscape, it ceases to shock in the same way. And that was frightening. The road became a corridor where time seemed suspended. Only the sound of the wind, the creaking of boots, the distant crackle of artillery. Each step led further away from the immediate encirclement, but also left more men behind. Winter continued to fall, patient and impartial. And along that endless white road, the human cost of the retreat was recorded, not in monuments, not on tombstones, but under meters of snow, where many would never be found. In the midst of that scene of ice and death, there was something that still warmed the soldiers' pockets: carefully folded pieces of paper, cards. Some were written days before the retreat began, others were hastily scribbled during brief pauses in the march. Many began the same way: "Dear Mother, my beloved, my son," and they all carried a pious lie: "I am fine. Winter isn't so bad. I'll be home soon." The men wrote, trying to protect those who were far from the brutal truth they were living. They didn't talk about frozen fingers. They didn't talk about friends abandoned in the snow. They didn't talk about the constant fear. They wrote about hope. Some carried these letters with them, hoping to find a post office further on. Others carried letters received months before, already worn at the folds, reread dozens of times on the coldest nights. There were soldiers who, before moving on, would place letters in the pockets of their dead comrades, believing that if they were ever found, those words would explain who they were. During the retreat, many of these cards never left the battlefield. When a man fell on the frozen road, the paper remained beside his body. The ink sometimes smudged with the dampness of the snow. Other times it froze intact, preserved like a time capsule beneath the ice. Years later, when the thaw revealed forgotten remains, some of these letters were found still legible. They spoke of simple dreams: go back home, to hug his wife, watching your child grow up, back to working on the farm, No glory, no politics, just ordinary life. But on that road of retreat, many of those dreams came to an end. There were also letters that were never finished, pages torn from military notebooks, sentences interrupted midway. Sometimes the handwriting started steady and ended shaky, a sign of extreme cold or exhaustion. If something happens to me, and the sentence remained suspended forever, for the survivors, carrying letters became a different kind of burden, not physical, but emotional, because each word reminded them of what was being lost there, step by step. While the war raged on with its tanks and artillery, those small sheets of paper told a different story. The story of ordinary men trapped inside a gigantic machine, from distant homes, of promises that would never be kept. The snow could cover the bodies, the wind could erase tracks, but the words, even frozen in time, remained as silent witnesses to what was abandoned in the retreat. And each undelivered letter was another life that winter took with it. Not all those who stayed behind died that same night. Some resisted, trembling, delirious, wrapped in soaked blankets that no longer warmed them, breathing in short intervals as if the air itself were too heavy to enter their lungs. And then came the footsteps in the snow. Red Army. Patrols advanced just behind the front line. They searched abandoned barns. They entered destroyed houses. They traversed roads where the German retreat had left a trail of bodies and abandoned equipment. Sometimes they found only silence. Other times they would hear a faint moan. Soviet soldiers approached cautiously, rifles raised. The winter had been cruel to both sides, and distrust was constant. But faced with a motionless man, unable even to raise his weapon, combat no longer existed. All that remained was the capture. For many of the wounded left behind, that was the end of one battle and the beginning of another. Some were disarmed and forcibly brought to their feet. Others had to be carried or dragged to safer positions. There were also those who simply didn't have the strength to react. They were left where they were, if their lives were already slipping away. Treatment varied. The accumulated hatred after years of invasion, destruction, and massacres weighed heavily on the hearts of many Soviet soldiers. But there was also discipline. There were orders. There was a need for information. Officers wanted interrogations. They wanted to understand the extent of the retreat. Those captured who managed to survive the first few hours were gathered together and sent to more stable rear bases. And there began another ordeal. Most were malnourished. Many had severe frostbite, infected wounds, bodies exhausted beyond human limits. The marches to the prisoner of war camps were long. Slowly, the group dwindled again, not from combat this time, but from utter weakness. For those men, the camp did not mean liberation from the war. It meant years of uncertainty, constant hunger, forced labor, disease, winter after winter away from home. Of the thousands captured during that phase of the withdrawal, many would never return. Some would die in the first months of captivity, others would survive, but would return years later as shadows of what they had once been. There were also those who, already badly wounded, did not even resist capture. Their bodies remained where they fell, frozen in the same position in which they had been found. The Soviet advance was not only pushing back the front line, he was collecting the remains of the retreat. Each captured man was living proof of the collapse. Each prisoner was a testament to the winter, the hunger, the decision to give up. And while the surviving German columns continued to retreat westward, those who remained behind began a different journey, one that could last for years. The war was changing form, but the suffering continued. From a strategic point of view, the retreat after the disaster at Stalingrad prevented the total annihilation of several German forces. The lines were shortened, some encirclements were avoided, and part of the army managed to reorganize further west. But on paper, they were repositioned divisions. In reality, they were devastated troops. Entire regiments were reduced to a few hundred men. Experienced officers died, veteran sergeants disappeared, equipment was abandoned in the snow. Each lost cannon, each destroyed vehicle, further weakened the capacity for resistance. The greatest impact, however, was moral. The belief in German invincibility vanished. After Stalingrad and the bloody retreat, it became clear that the Red Army was not only resisting, it was advancing with increasing strength, better organization, and mass production. The retreat saved lives at that moment, but it marked an irreversible turning point in the war in the East. The German offensive turned into desperate resistance. The price wasn't just territorial or strategic, it was human, visible in the blank faces of the survivors who no longer marched as conquerors, but as men simply trying to live until the next day. The retreat ended and the war continued, but for those who marched along the frozen road, something remained forever trapped in that winter. Years later, veterans remembered not only the battles, they remembered the cold, the moment they let go of a friend's hand, the comrades who died silently beside them. The abandonment became an invisible scar. Many carried guilt for the rest of their lives, wondering if they could have done something differently. But that winter, there were no fair choices. It was either survive or die together. When the snow melted, it revealed bodies, equipment, and unfinished stories. Many families never received a body to bury. Only the word missing. More than a military episode, that evacuation was a portrait of human limits. Abandoned in the snow is not a metaphor, it's reality. And for many survivors, even decades later, a part of them remained there, forever hearing the footsteps in the snow.